And we're going to start session 2 now, the role of women in the reconstruction of Afghanistan. Our moderators for this session will be Kristen Cordell, one of the central architects of the $216 million Promote program, USAID's largest single investment in gender equity and women's empowerment, and Shukria, Dellawar, Advocacy Manager for Women for Afghan Women and Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and esteemed colleagues. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon to discuss the role of women in the reconstruction of Afghanistan. Before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce myself along with each member of our distinguished panel. Actually, she just introduced me, so I'll skip that part. I will be discussing the necessary and the importance of Afghan women's role in constructing the future of Afghanistan. Though I'm not a development expert, my talk is based on a recent trip in Kabul and my work over the years on the Afghanistan conflict. It is my goal to give you an overview of women's accomplishments, the challenges they continue to face, and some recommendations going forward. Beside me is Mr. Thomas Rzemyk, my esteemed colleague, and Nicole Dhanraj. Their talk will center on the study that analyzes the successes and failures of other Muslim nations and addresses current and future security challenges that must be addressed in order to sustain the future success of economic prosperity. Next to them is Sonik Sadozai. She will explain the essentiality and value in providing computer literacy training for Afghan girls. And then, of course, my co-moderator, Kristen Cordell, will re-examine her original thesis in her publication, Women in Nation Building, the Case of Post-Conflict Afghanistan. She will also, after this panel is done, she will lead the question and answer session. I also want to extend my apologies from one of our speakers, Mariam Atmar, who could not make it today. She had a personal emergency, but we will try to fulfill that role as a team. In the wake of military campaigns, continued insecurity, and the ongoing threat of the Taliban, the path towards gender mainstreaming and including women in reconstruction has been a rocky and limited one. Despite these challenges, the Afghan government has worked closely with the United States and their allies to help women rebuild and recover from decades of violence. This effort cannot be underestimated, given that Afghan women were mostly barred from public life during the Taliban rule. It is important to note here that the violence against women and how they stepped away from public life in Afghanistan dates back to the Soviet invasion. However, since 2001, there has been internal and international support to improve conditions for women. During my trip to Kabul last month, I interviewed a host of women both at the micro and macro level. I was there for over 2 weeks. The first part of my trip focused on interviewing women in shelters. I interviewed staff and beneficiaries to learn about the causes of violence, how these cases are defended in court, and also to understand the various levels of trauma Afghan women continue to experience. The second part of my trip was focused on the wide range of actors working on women's rights. I interviewed a number of working women that have continued to change the status of women in Afghan society. I interviewed the Deputy Human Rights Commissioner, parliament members, civil society leaders, a police female commissioner, journalists, gender specialists, entrepreneurs, and attorneys. By interviewing a wide range of actors, from the most difficult cases to the very most empowered Afghan women, I think I have a good sense today to share with you some of those trip findings. What challenges Afghan women, what they have successfully changed in Afghanistan, and some recommendations for a way forward. Let me first start with the successes. A Ministry of Women's Affairs was established in 2001 during the Bonn 1 conference. Equal rights for women have been guaranteed since the establishment of a new constitution in 2004. More laws have been established to protect women from violence. Women have joined the security forces. They are now represented in the police and the army. Women have mobilized as a strong voter bloc in the electoral process. Media has flourished in Afghanistan, and women have established a strong voice in that sector. A tremendous effort at capacity building and vocational training has helped many Afghan women gain employment. More women and girls have been educated, and they have joined the workforce. Women have taken part in peace-building initiatives. They have been members of the High Peace Council. Most recently, women were included in informal talks in both Qatar and Norway. The Karzai administration has laid the groundwork for women's progress, and the Abdullah Ghani team is carrying that forward. First Lady Rula Ghani's public activism on women's rights is really helping mainstream gender. To sum it up, where women have had the capacity and the opportunity, they have served Afghan society well. However, huge challenges remain that continue to threaten the gains made and potentially reverse the situation. Almost every woman I spoke to in Kabul told me the first and foremost concern is security, security, security. The second biggest concern, even though they have gained their rights, equal rights in the Constitution, is the enforcement of the rule of law. Rule of law continues to be ineffective when women's cases are tried in courts. There's a lot of corruption, from the police to the judges to the prosecutors. They can be bribed. Even if a woman successfully manages to put an offender in jail, it's a matter of time, depending on his contacts and the amount of money he has before he can be out of jail. Fundamentalism and a negative cultural practices continue to persist. There is an increase in mafia and corruption. There is a huge brain drain in Afghanistan. Due to insecurity, a lot of young youth who are now educated and qualified, if they have the opportunity, they do and they attempt to leave the country. Some female MPs who have been in the lead in human rights activism are now allying with the power structure. Therefore, they can't criticize major women's rights violators and opponents. Female MPs have become more silent on women's issues. Women are divided between political and ethnic lines, paralyzing women's progress in the parliament and politics. Negative competition between Afghan women's rights activists and NGO leaders continue to persist. The mental, psychological, and emotional health of Afghans is an underlying cause of some of the violence against women. Afghanistan has been in war and violence for over 3 decades now, and this has taken a toll on the population, both male and female. Although many programs have been implemented for the physical health of Afghans, I think this is an area that more work can be done on the physical, mental, and psychological health of Afghans. The latest statistic I heard from the health ministry was that nearly 60% of Afghans suffer from some type of psychological, mental, or emotional disorder. Extreme poverty continues to affect all Afghans. And illiteracy, even though there's huge successes in education, it's still a huge concern for most Afghans. Here's my recommendations based on what the women in Kabul have told me. Greater focus on peace and security, implementation and enforcement of rule of law, building connections among global, regional, national, and local levels, increase women in security forces, both in the army and the police, more confidence building among the experienced and high-level women in power and the women in provinces, engage more women in national reconciliation, better and more training of clerics in the Islamic tradition, two-way training on rights, gender rights, more programs for improvement of Afghan mental, emotional, and psychological health. I can go on with these recommendations, but those are really the key. In conclusion, Afghan economic growth has been stifled by many factors, including a lack of proper infrastructure, supportive policies, and services for businesses. In addition to these challenges, women in Afghanistan face an even greater number of obstacles as a result of embedded patriarchal social norms and political structures. One of the most harmful tactics of the Taliban during their reign was the removal of women and girls from schools and the workforce. This lack of education greatly inhibited Afghan women's development, and as a result, economic development. Without an education, many women and girls were left without the skills necessary to fully participate in the country's reconstruction. Though progress has been made since 2001, its sustainability remains at risk. The Afghan economy is largely dependent on foreign aid, and as the amount of available aid continues to shrink, negative competition grows among various parties. Donors should prioritize funding programs that have sustainability models. The promotion of women's progress in Afghanistan is not only a moral imperative, but it's also a key economic factor. The participation of women is crucial to sustainable economic development. With the right support, women have the ability and the strength to influence the Afghan economy on a number of levels. But without a solution to the security crisis and without a more robust effort towards the implementation and enforcement of the rule of law, women will be unable to make genuine and lasting contribution to Afghan society. Despite unfavorable and hostile circumstances, there are still considerable number of Afghan women currently engaged in the country's economic sector as business owners, entrepreneurs, and employees. We cannot let this progress slip away. The growth of Afghanistan's economy is dependent upon the education and participation of both sexes. Addressing Afghanistan's challenges requires long-term focus and commitment by the international community. It is my hope that all of you will join me in advocating for a sustained commitment to the development of Afghanistan for all Afghans, women included. Thank you. Let me just introduce, I've introduced Thomas, but let me go a little bit more into his bio. His background spans from the fields of criminal justice, homeland security, security management, international security, counterterrorism, higher education, and leadership network security. His specific interest is in advancing an evidence-based approach in the development of domestic and international security strategies that address challenges in the United States and abroad. And since he will be co-speaking with Nicole, her career began in radiology as a diagnostic, imaging, and CT technologist in the US Army, where she spent 4 years before advancing to a position as technical director for a small radiology outpatient practice in the civilian world.
Good afternoon. I consider it an honor and a privilege to be invited to speak here before you today. I sit here with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Nicole Dhanraj, and Dr. Hillary Johnson-Lutz was unable to be with us today, so the three of us have put together this paper and this presentation over the last few months for this conference. So myself and Dr. Dhanraj are going to be presenting. In order to have a full understanding of our study, I just want to re-highlight Afghanistan's geography. Afghanistan's geography, as you know, is surrounded by 6 countries. It's the 41st largest nation in the world. The languages spoken are Pashto and Dari, and 99% of the residents of Afghanistan are of the Islam faith. Afghanistan is a landlocked mountainous country located within Southern Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia. The Hindu Kush Mountains running northeast to southwest across the country divide it into 3 major regions, which will be discussed extensively within our paper and study. The Central Highlands, which form part of the Himalayas and account for nearly 2/3 of the country's area, the southwestern plateau, which accounts for 1/4 of the land, and the smaller northern plains area, which contains the country's most fertile soil. Afghanistan's history, as covered by other presenters in this conference, is their economy right now structures around being a regional provider of wheat, and the citizens realize the profits that can be made from opium production. Opium production in Afghanistan has been on the rise since the U.S. occupation started in 2001. Based on UNDOC data, opium poppy cultivation was more in each of the growing seasons in the periods between 2004 and 2007 than in any one year during the Taliban rule. Also, more land is now used for opium in Afghanistan than for cocoa cultivation in Latin America. In 2007, 92% of the non-pharmaceutical grade opiates of the world market originated in Afghanistan. As emphasized earlier, this stands for more than $4 billion worth of income for the country of Afghanistan, the majority of it which goes to district officials, insurgents, warlords, and drug traffickers. Excuse me. Afghanistan's history and milestones to attempt to deal with some of the social cultural issues in Afghanistan, deal with the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, which took place from 1979 to 1989. During this time, there were efforts to emancipate women. Unfortunately, there was an aggressive literacy drive which promoted and endorsed legal rights and a right to work for women. In 1992, there was a civil war in the Mujahideen era, one of the worst abuses against women. In 1994, as research and history has shown, that was the peak of the Taliban rule, which implemented harsh interpretation of Islam law, also known as Sharia law. Post 9/11 was known as the Karzai regime, which in its attempt was to reform to a democratic state inclusive of women's inequalities. And there was a global concern for Afghanistan women, which created programs, initiatives, educational programs, and entrepreneurial programs for women in the country of Afghanistan. Continuing on, Afghanistan's country attempts to deal with cultural issues began with the 2003 Constitution for International Treaties. Quoted, "The citizens of Afghanistan, whether man or woman, have equal rights and duties before the law." Addressed past that was the Action Plan for Peace, Reconciliation, and Justice, also known as Transitional Justice. This was an attempt to address past human rights issues. In 2005, the Karzai regime and president decided not to move forward because it put a silence on some of the past human rights issues that moved forward. The next event was the Convention of the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, which led to the challenges was that there was poor enforcement, lack of awareness, lack of education, and there were also conservative traditions. There was a conflict of Islamic interpretation, and quoted, "There was no law can be contrary to the beliefs and provisions of the sacred religion of Islam."
So as we can see from earlier discussions, within the last 12 to 13 years, there has been some successes as well as some failures. We've discussed that, I think one of the presenters earlier mentioned that, for 12 years in comparison, what was the US doing as a 12-year-old nation? So we have seen some continued need for particular emphasis on different subjects. The next couple slides, we're going to talk about education and women's empowerment through entrepreneurial activity. And the issues that arise of this is that despite having the Constitution that promotes and protects human rights, we still have some segregation based on, whether it's urban or rural areas, and of course the cultural differences that result because of the patriarchal society in the rural areas, and also between the elite versus the poor, as we've seen in the more industrialized or at least the more successful areas compared to those rural ones. The need that we're going to promote, the need for self-sustenance is because the international monetary dependence is going to end at some time. We've had somebody earlier on talk about the USAID, that they have the commitment to funding, but it's still a sense of a finite resource. It's not gonna last forever, so it's imperative that there are certain initiatives that need to be undertaken so that Afghanistan on its own can be able to sustain itself. And a couple of those include, educating women and providing those entrepreneurial opportunities. And of course, as we've been reiterating all morning, addressing those security concerns. So one of the key things, I talk about having women's empowerment, but before we can even move forward there, is having that equality between men and women, having the education standard set that, yes, we're providing training for teachers, we're providing, school systems, the infrastructure, but having a curriculum, the content of that curriculum, being able to target what a new or a modern day society would want for women in terms of their roles, that having more of an interconnectedness, having the new way of life, or at least an adopted traditional values. And reducing that gender disparity will definitely help promote economic independence, again, by renegotiating their rules, changing women from the bystander to an active contributor of society. And the key way of doing that is, of course, through changing the cultural interpretations, looking at our neighboring countries and seeing how they have adopted maybe a hybridized version of Islam, a less harsh interpretation to move forth with, to release that power. And of course, having the government involvement. We talk about, again, having that voice, the woman's voice within the local government, as well as helping from a global perspective, having the combined efforts of women globally to help support local efforts. I know a couple of my colleagues here would also be talking about education, but we also, through our research, believe that education is actually the agent of social change. With that, women especially would be provided the resources to understand how they can become active contributors to society, be empowered, be given that confidence that they have the voice to speak for themselves. And then, of course, just having that knowledge helps them to understand that they have an active voice and that there's hope for the future. As we look at the neighboring countries for lessons learned, we can also look at the history of Afghanistan, even from under the Soviet rule, to see how we can more incorporate women in society. And from the times of when the natives of Afghanistan have fled to other countries for search of better life, whatever conditions that, trying to improve their life, having that new set of eyes and understanding how they can still perhaps have a different perspective of their interpretation of Islam, how they can be equals in society. So looking at other societies that they have participated in and seeing that how they can apply that to their own society within Afghanistan. So pretty much evaluating their own reality through the eyes of other Muslim nations. As far as the education policy, looking at neighboring countries such as Pakistan and seeing how they have integrated that to include women and have that equality and have the opportunity for women as well to be participative in the education system. And also looking at Iranian women gains over the last 10 years or so that have seen some significant improvements with the status of women in their society. Now, once we have this equality of men and women and being able to provide opportunities for them, having entrepreneurial activities as a source of empowerment, we've seen the research has shown that there's a huge connection between entrepreneurship and the state of the economy. And again, I believe one of our colleagues earlier this morning discussed that a little bit further, the importance of having those small businesses and the impact on the overall state of the economy. So providing the efforts that have been there already have shown that there's already been a 9% increase in household income. I mean, 9% probably to Westerners isn't that great, but again, looking at it in the context over the last 15 years of where they've come, it's a huge stepping stone for them. So female entrepreneurship on the whole has been increasing globally, especially in developing nations. It signals a sign of progress, a sign that the economy could be more productive and, of course, in the direction of being more successful. Now, entrepreneurial activities in the context of learning from neighbors, sourcing it in the activity of the Gulf Cooperation Council, such as the countries such as Oman, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, that they can also learn lessons of how those women in those areas have also implemented their own businesses. Now, it's still growing in those areas. It's growing in other developing nations such as South America, but there are still lessons to be learned of how they can mirror some of those principles in starting their business and the impact that the economy is having. Now, even though there are lessons to be learned, there still are some challenges that was mentioned earlier on. Some of, again, the social constraints, the stigmatism of a woman having her own business, the access to resources, risk aversion, starting something new already with the eyes on you. This is going against your traditional culture. Is a big challenge for these women there. And of course, not having the confidence, not having enough women mentors within the country to help support their cause. Some more challenges that we see are also just lack of education, business skills, the access to capital, resources. This morning we talked about also having private sector involvement, being able to contribute and help these women grow. We have our display over here about the Aria city and having that support for women to help develop those small businesses to help them thrive. So some recommendations that we came up with, again, is just that continued funding, those small microloans for women that we've seen establish over 175,000 businesses over the last few years, and to build upon current programs. And I believe my colleague here is probably going to talk a little bit more about Promote. So being able to have the external support to continue promoting the local programs so that we can have sustained success from those.
Okay, so moving on and discussing further the implementation challenges for educational and entrepreneurship programs within Afghanistan. As we discussed throughout this conference today, there's several security challenges that exist. The business environment is harmed by the poor security situation consisting of conflicts among Afghans on the other hand, and between Afghans and foreign troops on the other. So there's three primary security challenges. One is the return of a Taliban-driven regime. The second is the Afghan National Security Forces funding for resources, intelligence gathering, and troop competence. And the last security concern is violence among ethnic groups and tribes. The first security challenge, the return of a Taliban-driven regime, one of the main concerns is examining the current safety concerns in remote areas of Afghanistan. I speak from both a researcher, practitioner, educator, but also as a U.S. military veteran who had boots on the ground in 2004, just 3 years after the post-9/11 conflict. And I can tell you that the security situation has gotten better. However, there are still many security concerns as highlighted today in many of the remote areas outside the Kabul and Kandahar regions of Afghanistan. Past and current strategies that have led to success in maintaining sectors in which the Taliban no longer reside have proven to be somewhat successful, but there are still strides that need to be made, and many of those were addressed by other presenters here today. The second security challenge is the Afghan National Security Forces funding for resources, intelligence gathering, and troop competence. As you know, there is a severe lack in funding from the international community. As we've talked about today, as a collaborative group, as we move forward and with the troop withdrawal, there are many international contributors and donors that have withdrawn many dollars from the beginning of the post-9/11 war. So it's important that we try to line up additional funding from both the United States and the international community in order to fund sources in order to help the ANSF. There's also a growth limitation from the infiltration of Taliban and other militant forces. The presenter right before us from Britain, he highlighted that ISIL and ISIS, they're starting to infiltrate some of the areas in which the United States has actually withdrawn from. And it's a major challenge because ISIL is a global organization. They're recruiting through social media. They're recruiting on Facebook, on LinkedIn. They're going to college campuses, and they're profiling individuals that are known as, they're loners, they're black sheep. So here in the United States and abroad, and especially over in Afghanistan, it's not only Al-Qaeda that we have to worry about anymore. It's, as time moves forward, we're going to see more and more of these militant extremist groups come into light. Intelligence gathering efforts reduced due to limited amount of ANSF members. As the last presenter stated, right now we're at a peak with about 300 to 350,000 ANSF security members. Eventually, that's going to drop off as the United States somewhat withdraws. The third security challenge is violence amongst ethnic groups and tribes within the country of Afghanistan. The United States and international partners face significant obstacles from violence from different tribes throughout the country. There's also been a rise of violence among specific ethnic groups and tribes since the promotion of democracy, and this has not ceased with the truth withdrawal, and as we move forward and time progresses, this will also increase. And lastly, there are several strategies that the U.S. and its allies have implemented to reduce violence and adverse relations by trying to form better relationships with both the United Nations and other supporters of the mission in Afghanistan.
Now, the key to forging the way of success, continuing on, as someone also mentioned earlier on, is to take it slow. We can't come in there and expect to have, a well-established, stable society in a matter of a few years. So also the key is to be culturally sensitive as we implement programs, as we continue providing support on the ground, that we're culturally sensitive to their traditions. Perhaps getting religious leaders involved from other nations to help reframe their religious thinking, and of course having education that would promote awareness and opportunity for women. Again, women empowerment is critical to rebuilding and sustaining Afghanistan. It's important that we do continue to address these security concerns in a timely manner, and being cognizant that there is going to be change, albeit slowly. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas and Nicole. We will now...
Thank you. We're very humbled to be here before you.
We will now hear from Sonik Sadozai. She is the Executive Director and founder of the Afghan Women's Center for Excellence based in Irvine, California.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Sonik Sadozai. I am honored to serve as the president of Afghan Women's Center for Excellence. The center in American terms is a tax-exempt nonprofit, an international circle, an NGO, non-governmental organization. The purpose of the center, and I quote, to advance and promote women and children in Afghan society, both in the United States and Afghanistan, in order to enhance their civic engagement, meaningful participation in society, in their general health, welfare, and civil rights. In Afghanistan, billions of dollars spent every year on development and humanitarian assistance, but I would argue that little long-lasting change is not possible without raising literacy rate amongst females. These purposes are not theoretical. They come from personal life experiences. I was born in Kabul and I came to the United States. As so many come to this country to escape the tyranny of foreign oppression. In my case, the Russian invasion of my country. What I lived with, what I saw, and what still exists today is a community of women who are held down by customs, deprived of basic educational, employment, and civic opportunities. In the book, The Republic, the philosopher Plato speaks of a cave where a person is restrained and can only see shadows. And because of that, that is all she sees. She comes to believe the shadows are real. Well, life for women in Afghanistan is like being tied down and seeing only shadows. We come to believe that being beaten up is normal, that working 18 to 20 hours per day weaving is normal, that soothing or crying infants with opium on their gums is normal, that being uneducated is normal and non-participation in governing is normal. And as Plato observed, it is painful to see the light and find out these things are not normal at all. The more educated a mother is, the more likely she is to challenge the cultural norm, to give birth with skilled attendant present, and therefore more likely to survive childhood. She's more likely to register the birth of her children, to marry later and give birth later, to understand the value of education and have children who are attending school or support home-based programs. Kids who are vaccinated, who are well-nourished, and who survive infancy and then childhood. Her children are less likely to be involved in child labor, to be abused. They have more books in their home, and they live in a wealthier household. So in reconstructing the education system, we must consider the family unit, especially the mothers. The state of Afghan women is best understood by considering Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow said, we all have needs that must be met, starting with survival at the bottom, followed by security, followed by socialization, followed by self-esteem, followed finally by self-actualization. The reality is that Afghan woman is trapped somewhere between survival and security. Many describe Maslow's hierarchy as a pyramid, and using that metaphor, too many Afghan women are buried under the pyramid. The center is a nonprofit. We have over 35 Afghan professional women who are ready to come together in order to bring resources to our sisters so that they too can effectively participate as a world citizen. What does that have to do with rebuilding a sustainable Afghanistan? Everything. My friends, hear this. It matters nothing if one builds the most beautiful mosque in the world. Inside is corrupt and misled. In the same way, building the infrastructure of Afghanistan, when one half of populations are women and held back from education and technological education. So I come to you to say the Marshall Plan to save Afghanistan must include the providing of equal educational and technological opportunity for Afghan women. As an Afghan woman born in Afghanistan, I can say to all of you that we are hungry for access to education and technology, and yes, we are ready. I have a simple proposal which our center supports, gave to our women living in Afghanistan a tablet or laptop with access to internet so that over time they can elevate their awareness of how Afghan women live in other parts of the world. At the same time, provide our women with classes in computer literacy and access to a library of webinars that will educate our women in the same way as one might receive education from online university. At the Afghan Women's Center for Excellence, we are prepared to invest our time and resources to bridge the digital divide that keeps Afghan women not just in physical seclusion, but intellectual and educational seclusion. At the conferences like this, and with other organizations, we need to start talking about results in terms of human capital and the social rate of return, rather than in matrix, such as number of school built and teachers employed. We need to learn how to communicate the impact of investing education that may be less visible, but will have great long-term impact. The chain of violence, dependence, ignorance, servitude, and poverty in facilitating true change and peace are only possible through educating the women who are the guardian of our generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonik. I will hand it now over to Kristen Cordell. Kristen's going to speak on women and nation building, the case of post-conflict Afghanistan.
Thank you, and thank you all for having me. It's been a very interesting day, and I definitely learned a lot by participating, and I appreciate the time our panelists have taken to speak before you today, and I will attempt to sort of wrap up some of their comments and concerns and tell you a little bit about my research as well. I'd like to speak specifically to the gendered aspect of Reconstruction as opposed to the gendered aspect of Afghanistan. It's a really important theme that we're speaking on today on Reconstruction. And 20 years ago, gender and Reconstruction didn't actually ever appear in the same sentence. Probably not at AID, probably not at other places. And a lot has changed since then. It's now widely accepted that including women in all areas of development and diplomacy is actually key to achieving our national security and national diplomacy objectives, and that widespread inclusion early actually impacts the way that a state can become stable, transparent, and democratic. And for those of you that want to learn more about that, I encourage you to read Valerie Hudson's work on this topic that really was watershed in around 2002, 2003, showing that link between having higher rates of gender equality and emerging state stability, democracy, transparency, lack of corruption was actually there in the data. Around the same time as that link was discovered, I was working at the RAND Corporation on a report called Women in Nation Building that really dug into the process of what it means to recreate a state from a gendered perspective. And it was a very watershed report because it asked, what about this process is gendered? And what about the transition to becoming a state has a gender perspective? It wasn't about sort of piecemeal inclusion of women, but an overarching arc of transition to stability that a state would undergo and the pieces of that were gendered. In writing the report, we began to think about what happened in this space where nation building could be gendered, and specifically about Afghanistan, where it looked like we had that potential from the start, right? Because all of the people that were thinking and talking and advocating for the conflict in Afghanistan really had gender on their minds. Laura Bush, in her radio address to the nation, spoke of Afghan women and their needs in the earliest moments of the conflict. So it was very much in the national dialogue that was an issue that we wanted to talk more about, although it was in the national dialogue in a range of different ways. So what we weren't talking about is what you actually have to do to get there. We were talking about the fact that it's important and that it's transitory, but we weren't saying what to do to really address gender in that nation building process. And we weren't really talking about how it would be done and what methods would be most effective. And I think that's why Afghanistan's a really interesting case study, because now we have 13 years of development data that tells us what approaches were or were not successful in looking at this transition. It's very much a litmus test in that way, because when you look at the Reconstruction effort, you think about the different points in time when gender equity could or could not have been addressed, understanding that the political will to address it was very much there. I can tell you from working on this since that time in 2005 that it has very much been on the mind of policymakers. So our old arguments about there not being enough political will to do gender is just not accurate anymore. In fact, we have a foundation of political will that says gender equality is part of our national foreign policy objectives. This is also referred to as the Hillary Doctrine, which was coined by, again, Valerie Hudson in her new book on that topic. So all of these things being equal, the fact that we had these connections and this understanding of gender equality as an important part of state stability, what did we learn about this process and where the norms would change? And I would argue that we actually haven't learned that much, because we haven't really been able to dig down into the methods and the activity levels and understand how each decision, not just decisions around women, became incredibly important from an inclusive or gender perspective. And I think now is actually the critical time to answer these questions, because we're at a very critical point in which the US and other donors are deciding how to spend their now limited resources. So where once was an Ambassador Small Grants program at Embassy Kabul that could disperse money without really being strategic to women's groups, without being precise or calculated, but with in being more inclusive, is now a much more limited amount of funding where we really have to decide what worked best. And it's also incredibly important to emerging nation building efforts, that many of which are being repeated. So I thought I would tell you a little bit here about the Promote Project. The Promote Project is really significant because it doesn't just sort of appear to assist women. It's very much building on what's already been accomplished by the US government and other donors. We looked at the space in 2013 and we said, we have tremendous gains in health and education of women, which means they're healthy and they're educated and they're ready, but none of them are taking part in society in a meaningful way. So what do? So we decided, as opposed to continuing to sort of spread out our money on gender, we would really double down, and we created this $216 million project Promote. And it works on many of the areas my colleagues have mentioned, doing mentor and leadership training, economic empowerment activities, women's inclusion in governments, and civil society building from a gender perspective. And the only reason why Promote could work or can work is that the fact that it really does build on these investments we've made in the past. It says, yes, we've been doing nation building from a gender perspective for 13 years. Here's where we are. Can we make this final press to help Afghan women become involved in society? It works with 75,000 women between the ages of 18 and 30 and seeks to really get them into positions where they can excel and become inclusive, engaged members of society. And as my colleagues pointed out, this will be one of the deciding factors for how the Afghan economy, governance structures, overarching political systems thrive or do not thrive. Because to be inclusive is really the only way that they will be fully functional, fully representative, and something that can really be built on. And you've heard today that the environment is more precarious than ever to do this work. Health and education investments are much less scary to the groups that oppose them, right? Because they're somehow much less threatening than a women's empowerment project, much less a women's empowerment project of this size. We're seeing dramatic escalations, as Shukria mentioned, in the type of symbolic nature of violence against women. Just 3 weeks ago, girls on the way to school in Herat were attacked with acid. A young woman, Farkunda, was brutally murdered in an angry mob for virtually made-up crimes. That happened the last time I was in Kabul, and I'll tell you, the reaction was dramatic. High-profile women, judges, and parliamentarians are actually being targeted because they hold those roles. And Amnesty International recently reported that women working as human rights campaigners are targeted, and they don't have the actual assistance or security assistance to deal with those attacks. And I think in some ways it's a controversial idea, but I think that this is a direct reaction to the work we're doing. Many see rights as a zero-sum game in which men have so much and women have so much, and it balances out like a scale. And they see this happening, and they're concerned. And that's fair. I mean, this is very much a reaction and a fear-based reaction. Interestingly, you can see this in the data. Last year's Asia Foundation survey reported that many more women work outside the home as compared to 10 years ago, many. And they're working, so that means they can go to work. But when you poll people and say, should women work outside the home, less say that they should than 10 years ago. Which means because it's a survival, because the economy has to thrive, because these things they're dependent on these salaries of these women that have started to work, they're still working. But the society doesn't support that overall. And again, I think that this is a reaction we're seeing. So from a rebuilding or nation building perspective, we can really see that this is a critical time with a number of high stakes issues. Women must remain in the peace talks in a very substantive way. I don't know if any of you saw last week, President Ghani tweeted to that effect, which I thought was remarkable. And circling back to the RAND report I referenced earlier, one of the report's conclusions, although perhaps fairly obvious now, was that social change around gender equality would be highly emotive and requiring a continual reassessment of the values of both international organizations and the Afghan people. So think about that. Nation building as a process is an arc in which there are several decision points in which multiple actors have to reconsider their own strategic needs as well as the needs of the other party and make calculations based on those assumptions in an atmosphere with little known information, where information is scarce. And so we at USAID have done that calculation and decided to continue with Promote and to double down. But those are continual decisions that are always being made, and again, in a difficult environment. And when you look at those reassessments, you're not just seeing a decision point, but you're seeing really what the organization values. And I feel very strongly when I say that USAID greatly values gender equity in all of its work, not just in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but that these decision points are not a quick, easy, or painless process. They sometimes solicit blowback, like we're seeing now, and they sometimes solicit hardship and uncertainty. But by making these decision points along the way of the rebuilding process, it means we won't have to visit the rebuilding process altogether, which is what we see when women are excluded from it. So I think that's an important takeaway point. That by involving women in making these power-based decisions along the way, we really can avoid having to re-engage in all of these processes all over again in a situation where we'd have a failed state. So I think that's an important point to consider. And I also take my colleagues' points just in wrapping up on the sustainability piece. Sustainability itself is not a moment, it's a process, right? And thinking about these decision points ahead of time and what they'll mean in terms of values of both the international community and the Afghan people. So I hope this has been helpful. I think I may have raised more questions that I've answered, but these are things that we're always thinking about within this space and are incredibly important to continue the conversation on. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. Questions?
Hi, how you doing? I just have a comment. There was for Nicole's presentation, there was a terminology you guys used was hybridized Islam, and I feel like that kind of terminology paints a picture of Islam as being already something that's extreme. And we have other countries in Asia. We have Bangladesh, and I believe either Indonesia or Malaysia are Muslim countries, and they don't operate under any Sharia law. And in Bangladesh, we have a prime minister that's a woman. And I wonder if the issue isn't Islam; it's rather what you said, like the tribal customs. Because where in Bangladesh or other countries, it's, I would say, much more cosmopolitan. There were other cultures and much more denser population where those kind of customs cannot or doesn't get applied. So I wonder if I feel like those kind of terminologies gets taken by media and a wrong portrait is painted with those kind of terminologies. I just want to say that.
I couldn't agree with you more. I firmly agree that I believe that the Islam faith is something that's highly misinterpreted by both the media and just by the general population, just based off how the media covers it. I apologize if my remark came across as disrespectful or anything of that nature. Let me rephrase. Militant extremism is a primary concern, and as you've addressed, it's outside some of the larger provinces of Afghanistan where you run into the tribalism issues and some of the customs, as emphasized in my third security challenge, is you'll see that there's issues in between the different ethnicities and the different tribes. So, when you're going through some of the remote provinces in the Hindu Kush Mountains, for example, and you're on a military patrol and you're coming into a village where they've maybe never seen a Westerner before or have never seen U.S. military forces before, they know that we may be there with good intentions. However, looking at that village, it's and going in there from a remote standpoint, it's hard to determine if where the threat lies. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that I see exactly what you're saying. I think a lot of those threats come from the more remote areas that don't get exposed to Western civilization, and I think that's going to be a continued challenge as we move forward. And as Darren Stalker emphasized, it's through slow progression, it's through gradual, it's something that's going to take decades, it may even take another century. And one of the speakers today emphasized, and they compared Afghanistan is only 12 years old, and in comparison to the United States where we were when they were 12 years old, Afghanistan has come a long way in 12 years. There's been a lot of bloodshed, There's been a lot of lessons learned, both from a domestic and an international standpoint. But I think it's important to learn from those lessons and to progress forward with some of the strategies and initiatives that were emphasized here today, especially through Dr. Dhanraj and I's recommendation with promoting women. There's a lot of cultural challenges that exist, and I think it's also important to address mentorship and leadership programs for women. It's important to make sure there's enough financing for microfinance programs for women, and to really make women the forefront of Afghanistan. I think if women are put at the forefront of Afghanistan, I think the success rate will be a lot higher in the next few years to come. So I hope that answers your question.
And if I can add a point, thank you for your comment, and thank you for giving us a chance to clarify that. I think all of us on this panel agree that Islam isn't the problem. It's the misrepresentation of Islam that's the problem, and it's the fundamentalism. Thank you.
I don't know if you can. Oh, yeah, okay. So just to go off with his comment, I think yourself, you mentioned that Afghanistan should adopt less harsh version of Islam because from the neighboring countries. I'm not sure what you meant by that, because I don't. I do believe there's a large percentage of illiteracy in neighboring countries like Pakistan. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that.
It was more referring to the extremism, and I think Tom just pretty much covered that, relating to the interpretation of, when we look at the rural areas, looking at their interpretation of women's role, their traditional roles, but applying it from a utilitarian perspective. Well, okay, if their interpretation of women is not to be involved in the parliament, in the government, in society, but to be the caregiver at home, look at it in terms of, well, applying different roles outside those ingrained traditions. So my saying of less harsh interpretism is more so of trying to be less extreme and applying. Somebody mentioned earlier, I think, you have 21st century problems, but you're not fixing them with 20th century solutions. And, that really hit a spot with me, because I think especially it's going to be difficult when you go into these rural areas to convince the tribes here that, yes, women do have a role in society to play, that they should be given opportunity to have a voice in any part of society. So it was pretty much referring to the extremist views of Islam.
Views on cultural.
Yes.
Yeah, not religious.
Correct.
And
well, I guess when you look at it, is the interpretation, or as you mentioned.
If I can add a few points, and you're correct, it is cultural. Before the introduction of fundamentalism in Afghanistan, during the Russian invasion and during the Mujahideen era, a lot of fundamentalist interpretation of Islam was introduced to Afghanistan. The problem stems from there. Prior to that, and continuing, are negative cultural practices that has nothing to do with Islam, that has to do with ignorance and lack of education. And that's another measure that needs to be corrected. That's why I brought out in my recommendations that we need to educate the clerics in these rural areas in the proper understanding of Islam. Thank you.
I think this question is for everybody, and maybe you can answer. But I come from Toronto, and we have a lot of many social workers. Sometimes instead of creating harmony in the family, they break the family under the guise of women's rights. In your research, for example, did you find out that the harsh reaction that comes from the male in the patriarchal society is because the way the issues are brought into a family level is not the correct way of of posing the situation so that the family harmony will not be disrupted by it?
I'm not sure because I haven't done any research on social workers per se, but I do think that what you're referring to could be more attributed to diaspora. I mean, it's going to be quite a different. Oh, I thought you said Toronto. Okay. Here's the thing. If you go in and just work with women and tell them about their rights, it may cause an issue in the family because when they go back to the family to articulate those rights, again, there may be this feeling of ownership or a zero-sum game in which there's a reaction. And this happens in all societies. In Ireland, following the Troubles in the 90s, there was an increased violence at home after the conflict ended. And so it happens everywhere, the Balkans as well. So it's not just in Afghanistan. Here's what you have to do. First of all, as Shukria said, working with community leaders of the church and also teachers, and also working with men, telling men about women's rights, telling men how to be better fathers, better husbands, and how to allow women to really excel and be members of society in a way that actually benefits the entire family. And I think that's an important step. That's one step we take in Promote, our community engagement models, our whole of community engagement models.
I think having that education as well, when I mentioned the content of the curriculum, having the education, you're not just promoting women's rights, but you're also educating males on the impact of their rights on society. So you don't have those strife in the household.
I just want to say something. Afghanistan culture and custom 40 years ago accepted education. We had no problem with education. We were very, maybe they didn't have accessibility to education, to schools in the rural area, and the education was not promoted. But during the war, last 35 years, it got really worse. I think they just kind of, they don't want their woman to leave the house, maybe security, maybe there was a lot of uncertainty going on. But Afghanistan during, 40 years ago had everything. They were, they were accepting education. We had everything, but it got worse as the war started, so.
And if I can add a few points, sir. I have heard in my trips to Kabul, not only on the last one, but in previous fact-finding trips, that there is, when men are not, and men and women are not properly educated in their rights in Islam, then a Western country comes in, they're putting in programs, and there's been a lot of lessons learned over the 13 years how to do this work in a culturally and religious sensitive way in Afghanistan. And I know that Kristen, with the Promote program, is emphasizing that currently. Another thing is there's really no contradiction with women's rights and Islamic practices. The Prophet of Islam was employed by his first wife, Khadija. And there's a quote in the Quran that says, a believer should go as far as China to seek knowledge. And it says a believer. It does not say a man or a woman. Both are believers. So I just want to clarify that.
Yes.
It's the education it's economics. We were 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and my mom. We worked together with my father, and there was no veil, no burqa, or no nothing in the whole village. And I was throwing these bricks when I was 9. And still these people are doing the same thing. It's the economic situation that they cannot afford to bring food on the table, and that's why they have a problem with that. On the culture issue, women are, in some cases, they are the head of the tribes, and they participate in these jirgas. But it's still, again, it's the economics, it's the money they have to make. These are the stuff that it's very important. No one is against schools, education, and stuff like that.
Great. Well, thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for the lively discussion. And thanks for having us.
Thank you.